He only asked to use the restroom. No arguments. No raised voice. But a sudden shove sent him crashing down, his head slamming hard against a freezer in a crowded gas station. Blood flowed. Every eye turned away. No one helped. They thought he was just another nameless old man. But 30 minutes later, the ground began to tremble, and the men who used to call him Commander were already on their way. Welcome to TH. Let's uncover what really happened in life. It was a scorching Texas afternoon. Not a cloud in sight. No trees to offer shade. Only blistering pavement and the distant reek of asphalt rising off Highway 71. The Wallace Fuel gas station stood quietly along a nearly forgotten road, where big rigs often stopped for a smoke or a weak cup of coffee. A dry wind swept in, carrying red dust that clung to the worn-out shoes of the old man stepping in. Frank Miller, 84 years old, hunched over as he pushed open the door to the gas station. He wasn't begging for money. All he needed was a restroom, some water, and a minute of shade. "Hey, what are you doing?" A young attendant's voice rang out, yanking up the plexiglass shield at the counter. "I just need to use the bathroom. I can pay if needed." Frank answered, breath short. His voice was raspy, throat burning from the long walk. "We don't serve drifters." The attendant sneered, turning to his coworker as if it were a joke. A few customers fueling up turned their heads. Frank nodded. He didn't argue, didn't want any trouble. But just as he turned to leave, a sudden shove from behind slammed him headfirst into the freezer near the entrance. The sound of impact echoed like a gunshot, then silence. He collapsed onto the floor. A thin trail of blood trickled from his forehead. His canvas bag hit the ground, scattering a few food donation cans and a small silver chain that slipped off his neck, rolling to the corner of the counter. No one moved to help. One customer pulled out a phone, not call for help, but to record video. He freaked out, just slipped and fell. The attendant called out loudly, forcing a grin to break the awkward stillness. Frank pressed his palms to the floor, vision blurry. He didn't look at anyone, just at the necklace, engraved faintly with WD 237. Frank Miller sat with his back against the scorching brick wall behind the station, his left hand pressed to the bleeding wound on his temple. His eyes were closed, not from pain, but from shame. A quiet shame that dug deep into the bones. 40 years ago, the same hand had pulled a young soldier out of a burning armored vehicle in Fallujah. Back then, Frank had been the lead sergeant of the Mobile Technical Unit from the Marine Battalion War Dogs. A seasoned soldier, cold in the face of bombs and bullets, but never deaf to a cry for help. 3 Bronze Stars. 1 Purple Heart for shrapnel to the lungs. But today, the only things he received were a fall, a scornful stare, and a silent camera lens recording everything. Frank looked at his hand. In his palm was a small silver skull-shaped pendant, a chain once worn by every War Dogs member, like a badge of life and death. On its back was an old engraved code, WD 237, Emergency Recall Code. This keychain had once hung from the combat pack of every brother he served with, and by tradition, it would only be used again when the last member of the unit faced injustice. Frank didn't want to call, didn't want to trouble anyone over an old man in rags. But as blood dripped onto his hand, he clenched the pendant tighter, the cold metal reminding him of the cost of staying silent. A security guard finally arrived, slowly. No questions, no assistance, just a command. "You need to leave now, or I'm calling the cops." Frank nodded. No argument. He quietly slipped the chain back into his inner pocket. In the distance, the roar of a Harley engine rose from the freeway, carried by a light breeze. He didn't lift his head, but the corners of his eyes grew moist. Frank had only taken 3 steps out of the fuel station when a black Ford F-150 pickup screeched to a halt. From it jumped Brent Wallace, 38, wearing a tight white dress shirt and an expensive wristwatch. Brent stormed toward Frank, face tense. "What's going on here?" Brent asked the attendant, glancing at the old man whose forehead still bled. He started causing trouble, mumbled something, then hit his head. "We got the whole thing on video, Brent." Frank looked up. His quiet eyes met Brent's. And in that moment, past and present collided, Memory and betrayal layered as one. Frank remembered that day, when Brent was just a 12-year-old boy, thin and lost, standing beside his father's casket, Sergeant Wallace, at the Arlington Cemetery funeral. Frank had stood there, uniform sharp, hand on Brent's shoulder. "You'll never be alone, kid. Whenever you need me, I'll be there." Years later, Brent, now owner of Wallace Fuel, once handed Frank hot coffee, invited him inside on cold days. "If it weren't for Dad and you, I wouldn't be here," Brent had said. But now, Brent didn't help him up, didn't ask if he was okay. Instead, he looked straight at the employee's camera, then turned to Frank and said clearly, "We do not tolerate disruptive behavior. He assaulted my staff, damaged property." Frank froze. "What are you saying, Brent?" Brent looked away, said nothing, pulled out his phone, and called someone. "Yes, I need the police. We've got a dangerous disturbance here." Each word hit Frank like a nail in the chest. He didn't shout, didn't protest, just clutched the necklace tighter in his pocket, the only thing that hadn't betrayed him. When the police cruiser arrived, one of the attendants shoved Frank toward the officers. "That's him. He's the troublemaker." The officers didn't ask questions. One of them placed a firm hand on Frank's shoulder, turned him around. But in Frank's eyes, the disappointment wasn't aimed at strangers. It was reserved for the child who once called him Uncle. The handcuffs were cold as ice. Frank didn't resist as they pushed him into the backseat of the patrol car, but his gaze remained the same, quiet, unwavering, as if still searching for a reason to believe in people. The vehicle pulled away from the gas station, siren quiet. But to Frank, every sound outside had faded, replaced by a hollow emptiness in his chest, where his pride as a soldier had once been, now fractured beyond repair. The county police station was less than 10 miles away. Not a word was spoken during the ride. No one asked if he was in pain. The young officer behind the wheel occasionally glanced at Frank through the rearview mirror, his expression caught between disdain and discomfort. At the holding facility, Frank was asked to remove his shoes, his coat, and surrender all personal items. When the officer spotted the small silver necklace engraved with WD 237, he picked it up and turned it in his hand. "What's this? Evidence? Some kind of token?" Frank shook his head. "Old memory. Please return it later." The officer nodded half-heartedly and dropped it into a clear plastic bag, labeling it, "Property of inmate number 6742, Miller, F." Frank was placed alone in a small cell. Harsh fluorescent lighting made him squint. The walls were a dull white-gray, the air thick with bleach and the stale odor of dried urine. A quiet sigh escaped him, short and shallow. Never had he felt so invisible. The TV mounted in the cell echoed with the local news anchor's voice. "A homeless man has been arrested for assaulting a gas station employee at Wallace Fuel, currently under investigation. The victim, a minor, has been hospitalized with concussion." Frank couldn't believe his ears. A perfect fabrication, spun by those who used to call him Uncle, Hero, Veteran. His eyes landed on the surveillance camera, mounted in the corner of the ceiling. He said nothing, but inside, a quiet war was brewing. That night, he slept sitting up, head leaning against the wall, one hand still slightly clenched, as if still gripping something he refused to let go. The next morning, sunlight filtered to the barred window, casting faint lines across the cold cement floor. Frank opened his eyes. The sleep had brought no peace, only a dull ache in his neck and shoulders. He had endured worse nights in the forest of rock, but never one this lonely. A young officer opened the cell door and handed him a plastic tray, plain white bread, a boiled egg, and a small carton of milk. Frank thanked him, though the officer didn't even glance back. When the door clanged shut, Frank quietly brought the tray to the table, eyes drifting toward the wall-mounted phone in the hallway. No one said he couldn't call, but who would he call? He had lost touch with most of the War Dogs unit. Some had died, others had scattered across the states, some living off-grid, some disabled, and others, like him, forgotten by the very country they had once served. But there was still a chance. One man. Frank returned the tray and asked the officer on duty if he could retrieve the silver WD 237 necklace from his belongings. The officer hesitated, then finally agreed, Frank looked at the small object in his palm, as if staring at a door he feared would never open again. Then he stepped out, slid a calling card into the wall phone. The number he dialed wasn't saved in any contact list. It was a string engraved into his memory. 773-390 WD6. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. No answer. Frank was about to hang up when a low, gravelly voice came on, familiar as a combat heartbeat. My old CO's in trouble, isn't he? Frank didn't answer immediately. Then he spoke slowly. Need backup. Wallace Station. Last night. There was a short pause on the other end. Then a simple reply. Copy that. We're coming. Frank hung up and walked back to the holding cell. The young officer raised an eyebrow and joked. Who'd you call, your lawyer? Frank didn't respond. He sat back down, leaned against the wall, fingers gripping the chain, eyes gently closing. He knew no one might come. Maybe everything was just a memory. But if they remembered, if loyalty hadn't died with time, then maybe, just maybe, justice still had a way home. That afternoon, the town of Delmore simmered under the oppressive August heat. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until a low rumble began to roll in from the distance. Steady, growing, like the heartbeat of an oncoming storm. First came 3, then 7, then an entire convoy of gleaming black Harley-Davidson motorcycles, each marked with faded decals worn by time. Every rider wore a leather vest bearing the Silver Skull emblem. War Dogs, a legendary unit that once fought in the Middle East, now riding back like ghosts from memory. No sirens, no banners, no words, only the roar of engines like thunder, their presence freezing the gas station in place. Brent Wallace, the owner of the station, was standing in the parking lot. When he heard them, he looked up, squinting against the glare of the sun, and froze as the lead Harley rolled to a stop directly in front of him. A man climbed off the bike, older, broad-shouldered, weathered face like carved stone, eyes sharp as a blade that hadn't dulled. Brent Wallace? Brent stepped back. Who the hell are you? This is private property. I'm calling the cops. Good. Call them. And tell them to bring the full security footage from your station, the uncut version. Brent swallowed hard. Sweat broke across his forehead. One of the War Dogs, a smaller man with scarred hands, held up a USB drive. We've got a copy of the entire afternoon. And we also have audio, your conversation with the employee after the old man fell. Brent stiffened. His lips trembled. I don't know what you want, but... The lead rider didn't reply. He turned toward the row of Harleys behind him. One by one, the veterans dismounted. They stood in silent formation. No shouting, no threats, just silence, heavy and powerful. At that moment, a black SUV pulled up from the main road. Out stepped the governor of Texas, a familiar face to many in town. He didn't speak to the press. He walked straight to one of the War Dogs, shook his hand firmly. He saved my life in Kandahar, the governor said. Got me to a hospital when our convoy was ambushed. The crowd began to gather, silent, eyes shifting from suspicion to confusion, then to respect. Brent stepped back again, stammering. This is all a misunderstanding. I didn't mean... Mr. Frank Miller doesn't need an apology, one veteran replied. But this town needs a truth. Inside the station's office, a police inspector quietly inserted the USB into a computer. On the screen, black and white footage flickered to life. Frank Miller entering the gas station, calm, respectful. The young employee sneering, then suddenly shoving Frank from behind. No assault, no threats, just an elderly man being humiliated. Brent Wallace turned pale. The inspector didn't say a word. He simply gestured to 2 officers. The cold click of handcuffs echoed as they snapped around Brent's wrists. None of the War Dogs clapped. They weren't there for show. They only nodded slightly, as if confirming that the mission had been completed. Just then, Frank stepped out of the police cruiser, gently supported by one of the veterans. The crowd parted. He stood silently in front of the gas station, where, not even 24 hours ago, he had bled on the floor. The governor approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to say anything, Sergeant. They've seen it." Frank looked around. His eyes were wet, but not red. No tears, only the stillness of deep waters. Then he reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out the silver chain marked WD 237, and held it up over his chest, high. No words were needed, but everyone understood. A thank you, a farewell, and a quiet salute. The entire gas station went still. A young boy in the crowd instinctively placed a hand over his heart. A middle-aged man, likely a veteran, stood at attention, heels together. No speeches, no slogans. Honor doesn't need applause to be restored. Only truth, and those who are brave enough to carry it to the end. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it to spread this meaningful message, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments, because every perspective deserves to be heard.